Hi folks, Lou here to talk about something close to my heart, I guess, and that's war games. Now, a lot of people are against war games today, some because they think that it's about warfare, which it really isn't, and some simply because the prospect of playing a game with lots of little square counters on a board with lots of little hexes simply doesn't attract them, or perhaps it repels them. I talked to a Frenchman once at the World Board Gaming Championships, and he said if you want somebody to play a war game, don't call it a war game. Just say that it's an interesting game or a historical representation or something like that. Because once you say it's a war game, many people will just turn off. They won't play. But if you don't call it a war game, then they may play and enjoy it. Now that's partly because the game in question is probably not the hex-and-counter simulations that people associate with war games, but something else. It's a representation of history, or perhaps of science fiction or fantasy, that is much more relaxed and much less in your face, perhaps, than a historical simulation. It's also likely to be a game that might be for more than two players, whereas the historical simulations, the hex-and-counter games, are almost never for more than two players. In fact, that kind of game tends to fall more into a puzzle category than a game category. Even though there's a lot of interaction between the players, because the designers want to make history happen the way it happened. And that is not, in fact, sensible, because most of the time, or a large fraction of the time, I think, what actually happened in history is not what was most likely to happen. As I said, neither kind of war game, the out-and-out war games or the representations, actually shows much about warfare. There's no blood, no death. It's just not warfare. It's generalship. And that is usually what a war game of either kind reflects, is generalship. One person doing things better than the other, the commanding generals, and succeeding as a result. Now, how do you convey that to people? Well, I think that's something that's going to happen over time. There's already signs that people want games that have some greater connection with reality than in the past. Terraforming Mars, for example, I think is successful partly because people are doing something that appears to at least connect to reality, and which they can see improve and progress as they play the game. They can see Mars being terraformed. I am fairly doubtful that there's much in the game that's actually has anything to do with how terraforming would actually occur, but we don't know at this point how terraforming is going to actually occur. So what do we take away from this? First of all, if you design anything that could be called a war game, don't call it a war game. Call it a historical representation or something like that. Call it highly interactive. Call it a conflict game, perhaps even, because there are many conflicts that are not wars. But don't call it a war game. Now, some people react rather badly when I make this suggestion. But as a 68-year-old, I'm going to say those people are old fogies and we should ignore them because they're going to die off. And I'm also going to die off, of course, but I want to see the representation games become more popular because I want people to learn some history. Right now, we're at a point in the United States, at least, where people know almost no history, and what they do know is usually wrong. And games could help fix that, but it's a long-term task. Thanks for listening.